two today, Dr. Scott Simpson, who is a learning specialist with Thai and the co-director of the Wola Lakota project. His session, Listening to the Elders, will give us new ways to think about topics, strategies to try in the classroom, and a tour of the rich resource for Lakota information, the Wola Lakota site. So take it away, Scott.
Oh, thanks so much, Jane. Thanks, Joan. It's been just a wonderful morning so far. I was so happy to be able to sit in and listen to both Keith and Glenn, and lots and lots of wonderful connections. So I'm really excited about sharing some of this with all of you. We will be doing some interactive things a little bit later, and so we'll just but I want to right up front invite any questions that come up at any point. Please put those in on the chat, and I'm going to do my best to pay attention to that. But Jane and Joan have agreed both to kind of keep an eye on that as well, and let me know if a question comes up and I'm kind of moving on. I want to stop and address that. We've got that flexibility today. So just a little bit to give you a context for the Wola Lakota project. Many of you may know quite a bit about it, but I want to give you a context so you know where this is coming from. Wola Lakota project started around 3 years ago, and it was in response to a need perceived in our state. A group of elders, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota elders, had gotten together and written the Ocheti Shakoan Essential Understandings. But a group of teachers really needed to figure out how to make that happen in the classroom. What does that look like? Is it a separate Ocheti time during the day, or is it something that is more holistic, that's more embedded in all of the things that we do? And so the Wola Lakota project was born out of that. It's been supported. We're in our third pilot year, supported by South Dakota DOE. And there are two primary segments of that. One is the website that we'll be talking about, and the resources and the wonderful interviews with elders as well as Native educators and others that are archived there and are growing as well. And then the other part of this is the putting that into practice. We have a mentoring program that is combined with a series of retreats that grew out of our work with the Courage to Teach by Parker Palmer. I'll be talking a little bit about that. But what I'm going to be sharing today are some approaches that specifically address these video interviews as primary sources, the approaches that we're using with those in that context, but also helping you make connections with other contexts, and how this approach might address some problems that we continually face in our classrooms, both for our Native American students as well as our non-Native students and all of our students. So I hope you'll be thinking in those terms. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. We're going to kind of frame this around 4 elements. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the problematic context for the term sources. And this is some fairly fresh thinking on my part. As I was invited to be a part of this, I began thinking about primary and secondary sources, and then thinking about the term sources in general. As a learning specialist, as an educator myself, I wanted to get to the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about sources. And maybe we've looked at that in a very narrow way, or maybe we've inadvertently caused our students to look at that in a very narrow way. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about what I'm calling the Wola Lakota circles and the circle of trust approach, which grew directly out of our work with Courage to Teach and the Center for Courage and Renewal, and how that fits into addressing this problem that we have in our classroom. We're going to talk about learn about and learn from questions. That's the framework that we've used on the website with our resources as a help to teachers in utilizing those sources. And we're actually going to explore that a little bit and then have an interactive experience with some learn from questions a little bit later. And then near the end, we'll take a little bit of a resource tour. I'll take you to the website, show you around the website, primarily having in mind giving you some places to go when you have the time to go back and visit the website yourself. And then we'll have some time for question and answer at the end of that. But as I said, if you have any questions, if some connection pops up for you, please go right ahead and type that into the chat, and we'll address it as we go. I want to start with this question, and it's a broad question about sources. We're defining source in the broadest sense. What are the sources of my current state of understanding about anything? If I have some opinions, if I have some viewpoints, where did those come from? And I think this is an important element in our use of the term source, in helping our students think in this broadest sense. Why do I believe what it is I believe? We've had both Glenn and Keith have talked about students being able to think critically and to be able to formulate claims that are and support them and things like this. If I'm not even sure why I believe what I believe, I don't have a lot of practice in supporting what I believe. And so this is kind of the question, big question I want to start out with. What are the sources of my current state of understanding? I want to take you in a little brief trip back in fairly recent history, and this will maybe strike a familiarity for some of you. Back when I was going through teacher training, we had a lot of talk, as I recall, when I was in my undergrad work, around cognitive versus affective thinking. And of course, the cognitive is as I recall, that's where we kind of camp out. It's the analytical, it's the numerical, the measurable, the reasoning, the tangible, all of those kind of hard-edged sorts of things that we do so well in school. And then the affective has to do with values, with meaning. Oftentimes they're unmeasurable. They're intuitive. They're sort of intangible. They connect with the idea of wisdom, and oftentimes the affective hits us more in the emotion than in the cognitive reasoning. But as I recall, when I was doing my training, the big light bulb for everyone at that time was that if we continue to try to address the cognitive side of our students without taking into account the affective side of our students, we lose them. It's all great and fine to have this wonderful sort of very linear, logical, cognitive route that we as teachers oftentimes get excited about. But if our students have no excitement, are not touched in the emotional realm, in the affective realm, or in the heart, then they don't stay with us very long, no matter how exciting those cognitive exercises are for the rest of us. In more recent years, Gardner's work with multiple intelligences kind of opened up our thinking a little bit more as educators. We recognize that as people engage and make meaning, they do it in various ways. And some of us are much better in certain ways than others. Some of us are great with engaging linguistically or logically, while we have those other students and learners who are very musically inclined or deal with visual image. And we've addressed some of that earlier this morning, giving students multiple ways of entering in to making meaning out of data, out of primary sources or even secondary sources. But that kind of opened things up. So we've got these two things at work. The important idea that we have to address not only the cognitive but also the affective. And then more recently that different individuals engage with their environment in meaning making in different ways. And we want to address that with all of our students. We want to address that with our learners. So I want to step back to this term, sources. I like to try to place myself in the shoes of students. And for me, that means going back to my time as a student. And I'm going to think about my time in high school and in my undergraduate work. The term sources really had one context, and that was the classroom, and a very specific context was research. Now, what we're talking about here, we're talking about primary sources, and I don't want to give any sort of a lecture to a whole bunch of people who already know a whole lot about this concerning primary and secondary sources, but I do want to just look at this for the sake of thinking about where our students are when we even mention the word sources or when we have any sort of classroom discussion about sources. Because this is where I was at in high school and in college. If we're talking about sources, we're probably talking about a research paper. So first and foremost in my mind is, so which route, primary sources or secondary sources, might get me 2 or 3 pages toward knocking this paper out before my ramen noodles boil over? Fundamentally, that's what it came down to. I want to know which one is going to get me down the road on this project, on this assignment, so that I can get on to other things. Looking at primary sources, these are wonderful contemporary accounts written by someone who had firsthand experience, witnessed it. These are original documents. They're things like, as we've talked about earlier, diaries and letters and memoirs, journals, speeches, manuscripts. They can include newspapers and magazine clippings. They may include photographs, audio, video recordings, all those wonderful things that I think for us, those are really exciting. They're like taking a trip back in time. But when I go back to as a student, my fundamental question, which is going to get me further down the road in knocking this paper out before my ramen noodles boils over, so I can get on to my other things. These primary sources are pretty messy. If I'm really thinking about getting this paper done, they're not all that helpful to me. You see, because when we look at these second sources, well, my goodness, the function of these is to interpret primary sources. Oh, goodness. So I had all these messy things that I might be looking at, but here I've got someone who's ready to interpret them for me. This is a step removed from the event, but they interpret, they assign value, they let me know which are the important things. They conjecture, they draw conclusions about the events, and oftentimes those conclusions that are drawn come in nice, handy little headings for me inside these secondary resources. They're in the form of published works, okay? They're in journal articles and books, and they can include radio and television documentaries, but these are the words of experts, people who know this field. And if, as a student, I'm fundamentally unsure about how much I know about this or any other given field, I feel really comfortable leaning pretty heavily on these secondary sources and all the experts that are represented there. So the problematic context for this term, sources in our classrooms, the problem that it creates for us in the classroom is this. As a student, I'm no expert. So I fundamentally want lots and lots of expert voices who can interpret this stuff for me. And this shows us a lot about our students. They're unsure. They know that they don't know a lot. We're introducing them to new ways of thinking, new ideas, things that they may not have come across. And so there's comfort in the voice of the experts. Secondly, frankly, this is a research paper, so I'm more concerned with format and grammar than about what I might discover. I mean, one of the things that we have to face, if we're having students write and we're grading their writing, there's a great deal of anxiety that comes along simply with the process and format of writing. And I can engage to some degree with the content, but if I'm highly anxious about the writing itself, then my primary engagement with this research and with this paper is an engagement with the writing itself. I'm nervous about the structure. I'm nervous about what I'm writing. And so I'm not doing a lot of interpreting. I'm really relying on those experts to provide me with great content and then maybe a little bit of help through their headings and through their structure in how I'm going to structure what I'm putting together. Thirdly, frankly, I don't have or want to spend a whole lot of time on this, so I need some interpretation and some clear headings in my sources so I don't have to try to blaze some kind of a new trail. Now, I'm not claiming that all students are like this, but I think we could all agree that the majority of our students often spend quite a bit of time in this position, simply wanting in a practical sense to get the assignment done. And when I fundamentally just want to get the assignment done, then I want to find the clearest, fastest, easiest route. And that's a challenge that we have all the time as teachers in all areas. Lastly, I was assigned this topic. My primary interest is just getting the assignment done. As teachers, we hope to engage students in the discovery, in the excitement that we have for the discoveries to be made in primary sources, the amazing stories to be uncovered, the connections to be uncovered, and then the great questions that need to be developed. But quite often, they're primarily just interested in getting the assignment done. This is really a problem in our educational model, which is what I do a lot of thinking about. And it's what I had to think about as we were developing how we were going to help teachers utilize the Oceti, Shakoi, and Essential Understandings and the elder interviews connected with them. Much about our Western model for education pushes students to place sources into the what I put on my works cited page category rather than into the where my ideas and personal perspectives spring from category. This may not sound like that big of a deal, but it really is, because it shapes the whole perspective where the students are coming to our classrooms, to the sources, to the subject area with. First of all, students gravitate towards secondary sources that allow them to do passive research summaries they care little about. This connects wonderfully with what Glenn talked about, the crack. These secondary sources push students to be addicted to trivia crack. Basically, if I can find out what the experts say and be able to slap that together and put it together into something that grammatically and format fits what my teacher's asking for, then I've done a whole lot of gathering of trivia, but no real work in interpretation, no real work in digging, no real work in theorizing or supporting any sort of a claim or an idea that I might have. And secondly, students hold strong personal opinions. And this is, I think, really important. I want to highlight this because I think this is a key idea that we're very specifically with the Wool Lakota project that I think more of us need to become aware of. Students hold strong personal opinions with slim awareness of the genesis of those opinions or whether or not they are complete and valid. The issue here is not that students don't hold strong opinions. They do. But those strongly held opinions oftentimes have little to do with what's going on in school. And I want to show you what I mean by that. It's a little graphic that I put together that, and I'm calling it Sources of Knowing, a Divided Educational Model. And I want to look through this briefly and talk about this being the problem, the issue that we're dealing with our students. Many of our students, and many of us, in fact, have a very divided practice in life. Now, for the students, you see that the dark red line down the middle, an impenetrable line between school stuff and personal stuff. Now, the school stuff is what I do out of compliance. If I'm a good student, I'm told what I need to do. I want to get good grades. I want to do well. So I'm compliant. This is where that term sources falls into that what I put on my works cited page category in my brain. Sources are those things that I put on the works cited page because it's school stuff. It's what I do out of compliance. I gravitate toward those secondary sources when I'm doing research because they have all of those wonderful things from the experts and all the great structure that's already embedded there that helps me get right on down the line with my research. The problem is with the research, what I don't care about doesn't inform my personal life. I question whether or not students are doing a great deal of research about topics, and specifically in this, we're going to talk about our Native American neighbors here in our state. Is it possible that students could do a great deal of research about details concerning the Lakota and Dakota people here in our state and actually not have that impact their personal opinions about their neighbors, their personal view of their neighbors at all? Is it possible that that could just be an exercise in academic practice? If we look down at the bottom, one of the reasons I use primary sources is because I can't use these because I'd have to process them through my personal experience in order to interpret them. If we flip over to the right side and we look at my personal stuff as a student, these are the things that I care about. Well, I have some really strong personal opinions, but I may be somewhat unaware of where my ideas and personal perspectives spring from. Of course, we all know they probably come from experiences that I've had growing up, perspectives and opinions from my own parents, from a community I'm a part of. But if I have this strong division between what I'm doing as a student and what I do in my personal life, then all this wonderful work we talk about doing marvelous things in school that will impact and fundamentally change students. If I have this division here between school stuff and personal stuff, then the school stuff doesn't really help me process or adjust my opinions. They come from a different place and they reside in a different place in my brain. And part of the problem with this is this myth that has been created that I ran into all the time when I was teaching school, and I still run into it. This idea that when it comes to research, personal opinions have no place in school. So as a student, I can't or won't bring them into my class interactions. Now, this is simply not true. We know that anything that's important has to be driven by an opinion. The issue is not whether or not you have an opinion and whether or not your opinion has a valid place coming into the discussion or into the paper. It's whether or not you support that opinion, whether or not you've done due diligence in supporting or understanding the situation or listening to the other voices Uh, but students over and over again somehow get the impression that, well, my personal opinions are my personal opinions, and they don't have anything to do with my academic work. Now, this is a real problem for us, I think, when it comes to sources, because if I can't connect personally with a source, a primary source, connect personally enough so that I can begin to do some interpretation, begin to do some digging, and connect with it not only cognitively but also affectively, so that I care about this personal source. It touches me somehow in an emotional place. Then I am going to simply rely on those secondary sources, because fundamentally all I really care about is getting this assignment done. Let's bring in the experts. Let's look at what they've done, and let me do a nice little summary. A lot of this grows out of, and this comes from Parker Palmer's Courage to Teach. If you haven't read that, I'd strongly encourage you to pick that up, or anything else by Parker Palmer. You can also visit their website, the Center for Courage and Renewal, and I believe that is courageandrenewal.org. But this comes from his book, and he talks about the objectivist myth of knowing. And this is this idea that still stays embedded in our educational thought patterns, that there is this objectivity, this idealized objectivity. In this graphic, we have up there at the top the object to be known. This is the thing that we're going to be studying. We have there in the middle the expert, and in some cases those might be those secondary source experts, those wonderful historians who've done all the thinking for us and have organized it all for us very nicely. Or it might be the teacher who went off to university and got all that expert knowledge. We have some baffles in there, in that flow, in that downward flow of knowledge, and those are protection against subjective loss of fidelity. So what we want is that objective truth, that objective knowledge, to not be all sullied and muddied up with subjectivity. Those subjective personal opinions and experiences that can kind of muddle that objective knowledge. And then, of course, it flows on down from that expert, the secondary source, or from the teacher, in ways that protect against subjectivity again, to the learners, those amateurs down at the bottom, who are supposed to receive all that objective knowledge and not get all messy with strange little personal subjective opinions. Now, we know if you have worked in education at all and you take any sort of a constructivist viewpoint, we know that's not really how learning works. But it still, that this model works at us underneath the surface, and it's very problematic for both non-native students and for native students. And I do want to kind of move into talking about this issue, because these are the issues that we're trying to address within the Lakota Project. How do we address the needs of our Lakota and Dakota students that in many cases are not being addressed in our public schools or in any of our schools? And how do we also address the needs of our non-native students who are in all of these schools as well? Because the needs vary. But how do we address them? How do these understandings and perhaps these primary source elder interviews address those in different ways? So, but this objectivist myth is problematic for our non-native students in a couple of ways. First of all, we turn to Western scholars or history texts in order to understand our Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota neighbors, rather than going to our neighbors themselves to hear their stories. Now, you're well aware of this, that this is a problem we've had for a long time. If we're going to learn anything about the Lakota people, quite often, most of the sources we have turned to have been written by non-Lakota, non-Dakota historians. And this has been a problem for a long time. But that's something that's exacerbated by this objectivist myth of knowing. Secondly, many non-natives hold emotionally charged misunderstandings about the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota people that remain unchallenged because the stories of how those opinions were shaped remain hidden. Let me give you just one example of this. We have a lot of teachers who express a lot of discomfort with trying to bring the Oceti-Sakowin essential understandings into their classroom because they have some personal experiences. They feel uncomfortable. Maybe they've lived 30 miles from the res, but they've never been on the res because of some very specific experiences that they've had or some specific things that happened to them in their past within their family, maybe even historical experiences or stories that they hold. And so they know that they have this level of discomfort. They hold these highly emotionally charged misunderstandings, but it's very hard to bring those out into the light in order to begin to address and to bring in some of these, because all of these understandings become for them, if they're struggling with that, they become triggers. And they feel just much more comfortable. Let me just deal with English literature. Let me just deal with math. Let me just deal with science, okay? I have some personal stuff. And we go back to that division between the personal and the school. And if it's happening with teachers, we recognize it's also happening with students, non-native students who are in the classroom. And we have a nervousness that non-native students may have some emotionally charged misunderstandings, and that if we then enter into looking at some of these Oceti-Sakowin essential understandings, or looking at some of these interviews with elders, that some of those things might come into the light, and we're not sure we want to get into that messiness. Well, let's look at the problem for Native students, because there's a devastating problem for Native students when we have this division between the personal and the school. For those Native students, first of all, the biggest problem is their identity is not reflected in their classroom or curriculum, and the historical and there's a historical subversion of culture and language and Native identity that is perpetuated in those classrooms because we're studying non-Native perspectives about Native people, and we're not seeing or hearing Native perspectives. We're not seeing or hearing the Native perspective on these historical events. And so their identity is not reflected in many cases in the school. Second of all, there's a misconception that success in the white man's education is essentially necessitates assimilation and giving up of Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota ways of being, because there's no connecting place between the stories of home and the stories of school. Now, I don't want to claim that we intentionally do this in schools, but we have the historical precedent when we talk about the boarding school situation, and we have many, many grandparents and parents who have direct and very recent memory of situations in which white man's education was essentially assimilation. So that's where this attitude has come from, and that still is incredibly prevalent. So as a Native student coming into a classroom, if I don't see myself at all in the classroom, in this, whether it's a public school, whether it's a BIE school, or even in some cases a tribal school, but if I don't see my identity reflected there, and if I sense that the whole process of getting an education is essentially becoming assimilated, um, then I have a real problem. I'm not able to bring my home stuff to my school stuff. I'm not able to break down that barrier in the middle. What I'd like to do, I believe Joan is going to take us to a quick video right now, in which Jesse Taken Alive, one of our wonderful elders here in the state, is going to talk briefly about this.
So with regard to education, when we look at um, the American dream and the Lakota dream, how can we put those together? Um, some will say we can't, some will say we shouldn't. And my personal view is that we must, for the sake of our children, for the sake of our children, that we must put something together so they feel that they don't have to abandon their being as Lakota. You shouldn't have to abandon that. You shouldn't have to feel embarrassed. You shouldn't have to look at that as secondary. That's what you are first. That's what you breathe first. You breathe Lakota. And that, yes, we can be a part of the American dream.
Wonderful words from Jesse, and I want to, as we go back to the PowerPoint, I want to just talk about what's key here, and kind of do a little summary of what we've got here. We have this division. We know that we learn best when we bring our full selves, everything that we are, our full identity to the table in the classroom. And when we have this division in the classroom, where we have Native students saying, I can't really bring my identity to the classroom, then we don't have the learning happening in the classroom for those Native students that needs to happen. When we have non-Native students, any students, coming to school and saying, well, this is my academic stuff, I can't really bring my personal stuff, then we don't have the learning that could happen, the learning that's possible. And that's our fundamental problem. That's the problem we need to address. And when we get back to talking about sources, this is the reason why secondary sources tend to be the thing that is relied on, and why it's so difficult to move into actually using primary sources. Because I truly, whether I'm native or non-native, any human being, I've got to bring my full self to be able to engage with a primary source, to connect with it, not just cognitively, but also affectively, and begin to do that tough job of interpreting. And one of the things that I wrote down as I was listening this morning, I think it is much better to have students fumble around with interpreting primary sources than to simply settle for having them create perfect summaries of secondary sources. I'll say it again. It's better to have students fumble around with interpreting primary sources, even though they'll be making mistakes, than to simply settle for having perfect summaries of secondary sources. That's how we engage them in the real work, the real deal. So I want to talk real quickly, and I'm going to move fairly quickly because I want to move into our interactive part here. This also comes from Parker Palmer. This is the circle of trust, and I want to contrast this to that objectivist myth. You see here we have in the center not a an object of study. Oh, this next question, what part of my being is being invited to engage with this source and this community? What part of my being is being invited to engage with this source and this community? I want to just a quick reminder about the two things that we've talked about earlier, cognitive versus affective. Am I being engaged at the affective level as well as the cognitive? And how are you engaging my particular way of interacting with the world? Are you engaging it? So we're going to talk about some specifics from the website. This is a screenshot from the website of one of our elder interviews. And right now, we're going to pull that up and we're going to watch this brief interview. And then we're going to go back and talk about the learn about and learn from questions and how those interact. And then we're going to have an experience with that and hopefully have a little time for some question and answer after that.
The Missouri River was the only treed areas. And as I said, there was all kinds of fruit, wildlife, and to sustain this, I grew up eating all this stuff and knowing what the foods are. And the Fish and Wildlife had an article not long ago about Indian foods. I said they forgot one thing, chanakpa, tree ears. But those tree ears are mushrooms that grew on trees. The Indians ate those because they're finding out that those mushrooms were really nutritious, you know. And you find those things. And then when the carriers were traveling from one reservation to the other, and of course in those days, as I say, no transportation, so they either just went on foot, but you could dig turnips out here. Right along this bluff, we would probably go out there and find the Indian turnips this spring. The Indian turnip is got a nice flower on top, kind of a purplish flower, and the stem is furry, but underneath is a turnip, and that turnip's got a. Now I used to have a whole string up here, but I guess my grandsons took it. Has a bark on it like a tree. Only what you do is you just peel it, and in the center you'll find this nice white turnip. That was one of the things that the Indian people dried. See, they used the sun to cure their food. There was no refrigeration, so they were ingenious in using the sun and harvesting these foods in season. You know, like a turnip, a June berry. Only in June you harvest those because, you know, they turn bitter. And I wanted to tell the Fish and Wildlife that, but I never got a chance to. But the chanakpa is a tree ear.
As Joan takes us back to the PowerPoint, I want to just mention we're so honored to be able to. We spent a couple of years, hours and hours with Vernon, and just captured wonderful interview with him. He did just pass away just a couple of weeks ago, and that really highlights the importance of the collection of these incredibly wonderful primary resources. These are things that are dying with the people who hold them. But to listen to this little clip from our interview with Vernon is a perfect example of a primary resource. Vernon is talking out of his direct experience. Now, on the website, what you'll find is a page that looks very much like this, and these are going to spring out here so you'll be able to see a little bit better. We have learn about questions for help for teachers. These are dealing with more informational level. So these might be places to begin with some research starters. What are the fruits and foods and wildlife that the Missouri River environment supplied? What do chanakpa, tree ears, look like? Here's some very practical things that might be researched, or I might find, if I have access to elders, might find an elder and ask an elder about that. This really can address the analytical, the numerical, and all that cognitive stuff. It really addresses that well, and it engages me perhaps in some research, a research project. And if I'm working with a great teacher who's aware of multiple intelligences and things like that, it may even, it's certainly going to address if I'm a linguistic learner, if I'm great with logical things, intrapersonal, if I really just thrive on deep research, these might engage me really well. I might be engaged in some of those others as well if my teacher gives me some options for a final project that might involve music or engage me with visual. But when we start with the cognitive, and I want to make this point, when we start with the cognitive, it's difficult to move from the cognitive toward the affective. So I want to look at these learn from questions. Look at these sorts of questions. What are the foods that grow naturally where I live? How much of the food that I eat comes from somewhere far away? What are the implications for us as a society to be more dependent upon imported foods than people in the past? What are my experiences with gardening or with wild foods or with eating wild game? Now, what we engage people with, both students and educators, is a circle work where I do a little bit of journaling, and then I would share in the circle, and we have touchstones, which are sorts of norms that we use, but I engage in the circle. But what I'm engaging with is my own personal experience, how it connects with some of what Mr. Ashley shared. This connects with me at the level of values and meaning, intuition, the intangible, even wisdom that I've gained from a grandparent. And when we've engaged with this very interview with educators, teachers, adults, and students, the discussions, the conversations are amazing. And I'm certainly engaged if I'm a linguistic learner, if I'm logical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, but also all the other things, because what I'm able to do in community is share my route of connection, my route of meaning making through story. When I share with you the story of how grandfather showed me how to go hunting, or when I share how I used to spend lots and lots of time with my mother in the garden and what I learned from that, then or maybe I'll even share the song that my mother taught me to remember when to plant. Okay, I can connect with all of these in all these very personal ways that engage me at the affective level. Now, when we move from the affective toward the cognitive, that's a much easier move. The affective, when I'm engaged at the heart level, in my personal experience level, suddenly I have the energy and the impetus to move into the cognitive, rather than it just being a school thing. It is a personal thing. And I'm ready to teach with a primary source. I'm already interpreting. I'm busy with that work, the great rich work. So here's that first graphic. What we're talking about is a holistic learning model in which learning stuff, I do what I do because I'm a living, breathing, curious human being. There's not school stuff and personal stuff. It's all learning stuff. The secondary sources certainly help out because I want to know more about the things that I care about. And that's where I get a sense of what's happening in the field. But the primary sources are engaging because I process those, because my personal experience is open to that. And if I engage at the personal level, I'm already in the midst of interpreting and understanding a primary source. One of the things that occurred to me that I believe it was Glenn talked about, if I can find Glenn talked about why would people move from Detroit? Okay, and when students are engaging with why would people move from Detroit, and then they might engage with stepping back in history, why would people move from the East in the 1800s. Well, that's great. That's wonderful. That's this shifting back and forth in history. But what about this question? Have I ever moved? Why did my family move? And then on top of that, how did that feel? How did we respond to that? When I begin to connect at that level, that brings all kinds of significance to the shift out of Detroit, to the westward expansion from the east. It opens it up at a personal level. Now, what we're going to do, and we're running a little short on time, but we do definitely have time for this, and so we're going to take the time to do this. We're going to interact with this. We're going to watch a wonderful interview with Joseph Marshall III. This is a self-timed interview, which means it'll run for a little more than 8 minutes. You'll get some instructions and some questions. If we could pause that just for a moment. There we go. You'll get some instructions and some questions, and then you'll also have a little bit of time to do a little bit of journaling. Now, what I'd like you to do, you can either just do some thinking about this. If you've got something you want to physically write on, that's great. If you want to open up a Word document and type a little bit, that would be great too, because I'm going to invite, when we come back together after this 8.5 minutes or so, I'm going to invite some of you to put a little bit, to share just a little bit of what your thinking was in the chat feature, and we'll see what we get from that. And this is kind of our virtual way of forming our circle and having a little bit of a discussion. Okay.
And it gets back to who's in control. It's that simple. Who gets to write the books? Who gets to tell the stories now? That's called our history. I think a good example is something that happened up at the Little Bighorn battlefield in 1983, 1984. Up to that point, the white historians had a strong tendency to go along with or discount some of the oral stories that our side told about how the battle progressed and how it came, how it ended. The famous last stand where Custer and the 7th Cavalry went out with a blaze of glory, both guns blazing, as it were. In 83 and 84, there were grass fires that went through that area. And officially, there's only 2 sites that are designated, one on the far south, and one on the north side, where the visitor center is, and then there's a site on the bluffs above the river. And if you've ever been there, the river just meanders, and it's flat river bottom one side and big hills on the other side. The grass fire went through there, and what it did was uncover a lot of metal artifacts, belt buckles, boot buckles, shell casings, round lead balls, all kinds of things. And archaeologists went in there and cataloged every one of those things, and there were hundreds of them, maybe even thousands. And they carefully recorded what each one was, where it was, and they spent a lot of time doing that. And then they identified what each of those artifacts were. An incoming round ball was usually an Indian, from an Indian weapon, because the cavalry was using a specific kind of weapon that could be easily identifiable. So they could tell what might have been outgoing fire and incoming fire at any given area. And as they did their research, and as they correlated all that information, and then compared it to the military version of the battle and the Lakota Cheyenne version of the battle, they found out that the artifact distribution coincided much more with the Lakota Cheyenne version of the battle. And it really gave that oral story, that oral sense of our way we keep our stories and our history, much more credibility in our eyes. It's still an uphill struggle, but no system is infallible, but it still worked, because that discovery of the artifacts just affirmed what our ancestors have been telling all these years. So oral history is important. I mean, it should still be important part of the process, and it should start with the family, saying, okay, this is who we are, And this is who your grandparents are on both sides. It doesn't matter how you feel about them or whatever. This is who we are. This is where we came from. This is what they did for a living. They were in the Army, they were in the Navy, whatever they did. They were school teachers, whatever. Go back as far as you can. Because that's the easiest way to give that child that sense of identity and that footing so that you can walk with that knowledge all the time. And that's where oral history can really, really serve a purpose. It's not just for the collective, it's more for the individual, or should be.
Okay. Thank you. We've already got some folks sharing. Thank you so much. We'll get into that in just a second. I want to say something about format here. This is what we're calling a self-timed video. Most of the videos, we've made a few of these, something new. We've been doing this last year, but all of the video interviews are accompanied by the physical questions that are there on the page, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But what would normally happen here, if we were doing this in circle, is at the end of that, then we'd open up the circle, we'd invite some sharing as we within the chat feature. And what we'd be doing then is learning more, a deeper understanding of some of what Mr. Marshall shared with us, but also deeper connections with those in our community of learning, some of whom might be native, some of whom might be non-native, some of whom might have a great deal of expertise, some of whom they may be encountering some of these ideas for the very first time. So I just want to read a couple of these, and feel free, if you've got a little bit to share, to share that as well. Also, if you'd like to share a little bit about the process, that's fine too. So Cheryl shares this. Oral history that my mother-in-law shared or on our area when she was a girl as her parents homesteaded. I also share this with students in my classroom. Whenever we can share those things that say, hey, I'm tapping into things that my grandparents have shared with me. We model that richness of that kind of oral history that Mr. Marshall was talking about. Angela shares, I taped an interview with my grandpa from Switzerland and how he came through Ellis Island. How wonderful. And those kinds of things, it takes history to this different place, because it situates me there in the dynamic. I'm not just finding out about events and things that happened and trying to think about how I might care about that. I do care about it because I'm situated in somehow in the middle of it. It impacts me. And then I have a recognition that what I do then impacts my children. Joan shared, my parents always shared what happened surrounding the time we were born, all 6 of us. So to have that identity where you're connected deeply with this specific thing that was going on right when you were born. Now, the process then here in circle, if you can picture this, would be us sitting around. We've engaged with this wonderful interview, this primary source, who introduced us to some ideas, some concepts, but then we've also engaged in some deep listening and some deep sharing with each other, others around the circle. And I'm not only finding out, what do I think about what Mr. Marshall's talking about? I'm finding out about what these other several people think about when they connect with the stories that Mr. Marshall was sharing. So now, that happens, in this case, it happened with one of these self-timed videos. The other ones work very similarly, and I'm going to go to the website in just a moment and show you what that looks like so you'll know what you're looking for when you go there. And I think probably, given the time that we've got, I think we probably better go ahead and do that. And I'm going to, if you can certainly continue to share a few things out of that experience if you'd like to put those into that chat, and I think I'm gonna shift over and share my screen and take you all over to the Wolacota website. There we go. So the address, of course, is wolacotaproject.org, and this is what you'll find on the first page here. And if you go down, you'll see actually what we listened to from Jesse Taken Live is right there on that first page, and also U.S. Education Arnie Duncan giving us a shout out just this last year, giving the Wolacota Project a shout out. So we're pretty proud of that. Up here at the top under tabs, I want to just take you tab to tab real quickly and show you a couple of things. This first one that says OSEU Introduction, if you click on that tab, what you'll find underneath it is a series of interviews with Adi Labo, the authors of the Ocheti Shako and Essential Understandings. And she talks from an elder and author's point of view of what they were doing as they were writing those. And then this is a link that links over to the SDDOE document. If you're not familiar with the OSEUs, I'm certain most of you probably are, but that's where you can find that document. This is about the Wool Lakota learning model, a little more in depth with a lot of the things that we have already talked about. And then here at the bottom, I want to highlight this. This link will give you a longer document that explores a number of connections with that learning model and this approach. So I'd encourage you to check that out. You can learn more about some of the other elements of the program, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that under the Wool Lakota project elements. I want to go directly to the all video reviews. Each of the understandings has its own separate link. So I'm going to click on number 1, OSEU 1, and what you'll find on all of these pages is the short version of the understanding listed. And then underneath that, usually a playlist that's several of the interviews. But then you'll see the interviews listed out. And these are all interviews with various elders to understanding number 1, which is the understanding concerning the relationship with the natural resources and the land base of the Ocheti Shakoin. And so when you click on one of those, most of them begin with, you've got some music in here as well. We'll look at Sydney Birds, one of our elders from Flandreau. And when we click on that, what you have is you have his interview, and then you've got the learn about and the learn from questions. And so those are there on each one of those so that teachers who are coming in and utilizing that can create within the circle, and this is one of the things that we do in retreat, and we do some modeling with teachers to help them learn what might that look like if in my science class we decide to do that, if in my English class we decide to do that. Two other things that I want to point out. Wool Lakota, right here, we have lots and lots of resources listed here. At the very, very top, the Wool Lakota video full playlists. This will give you, if you click there, all the lists of all of the interviews. They're not aligned here, but the full. If you think I could just listen to, I think someone said I could just listen to Vernon Ashley all day. Well, as we get more and more of that full interview up there, then that'll be a separate playlist that you could do there. Lastly, I want to point out the Wool Lakota staff developed lessons. Part of our job has been to go to schools and to do modeling, and we've designed lessons that are aligned with the OSEU and with the Common Core, and those are at different levels, and those are all offered free. They're Prezi based, so when you click in there, you'll find a Prezi. And I think I'm ready to head back to the. I'm going to stop sharing and go back to the PowerPoint to wrap things up. But I'll invite any additional questions. Let's see. Oh, here, what do I need to do? Stop sharing? There we
go. Okay.
Terrific. I know we're just about out of time. But I would invite any other questions or thoughts, things that haven't been touched on, or I'd encourage you to explore the website. There are lots and lots of things there, and we're just finding brand new ways to use them all the time. And you should also know South Dakota DOE they funded all of those interviews, and they are funding more this year. We're in the midst of, probably by the end of this school year, we'll have an additional nearly 100 interview clips that we'll be adding to the website as well.
That's great. I do also encourage all of you to go to the website because it is such a rich resource. Tons of great information for you and your students. Any questions? We've got 2 minutes. This is Scott's contact information if you want to get in touch with him later.
And I think one of the key things that I'd like to just really drive home is this breaking down that barrier in the classroom. It's uncomfortable when we actually ask students and we ask ourselves to bring our whole selves to the table and engage in conversations and even engage in the writing, the wonderful writing that we need to do and the reading that we need to do, but bringing our full selves. And as I've been thinking about how I could maybe find, and maybe some of you know of something, a survey that we could do with students where we could find, are those barriers there? Are they coming openly and bringing their full self, or are they coming into our classrooms holding quite a bit back? Because we've had a lot of experiences where we found out, wow, there were barriers here for these students that the teachers knew nothing about, and they didn't intend to set those up, but they were there, you know.
Well, Scott, thanks so much for helping us learn to think maybe in some new ways and some ways we can use with our students to help them bring their whole selves and get them better connected to their own families as well as content material and use primary sources.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for being with us, and we're ready to wrap this up. So I'm going to go back to our final screen, which is talking about the email that you will get, the evaluation. And you're going to want to do the evaluation because you can earn up to 3 hours, depending on how many sessions of this you attended, continuing education contact hours, as well as a chance to win one of 6 books. So we'll want that completed by next Wednesday, and we'll be doing the drawing and letting everyone know who the winners are. Those books will be mailed out to the winners. So any final thoughts? I want to greatly thank Library of Congress, TPS, and Keith for working with us on this grant. And we've been able to provide some really good, solid education about primary sources, thanks to the Library of Congress. Thanks, Keith, for your presentation this morning. Thanks again to Glenn and to Dr. Scott Simpson. It was a great day. Thank you.